So in the previous video, I brought you to the point where I told you what you want to look for is clinical trials. That's the gold standard. So I want to start by talking about why clinical trials are better. So the issue has to do with causation versus correlation. I want to talk a little bit about what those two words mean. So causation, what we want in science is to prove that there is a cause and effect relationship between two variables. There are natural processes that go on in our bodies, say, and what we want to show is that when we encounter some factor X, it influences that natural process and has some outcome. That's what we want to prove. With a correlation, what you show is not that X causes Y, but instead you show that X and Y are present simultaneously. It's a subtle difference, but I hope that you'll see what the difference is. So I want to show you an example of a correlation. Here are two things that happen simultaneously. So for the years 1996 through 2000, which are discrete years, each year had two characteristics. It had, during that year, the number of lemons that were imported to the U.S. from Mexico, and it also had with it the total U.S. highway fatality rates. That's typical of those years. Now, if you plot the number of the highway fatality rate on the y-axis and on the x-axis plot the number of lemons that were coming into the U.S. from Mexico, what you'll see is that as the number of lemons coming in from Mexico increase, highway fatalities drop. That's the relationship. Okay, so that's correlation. And from that, if you're not careful, you might think, well, does that mean that lemons are preventing highway fatalities? Okay, so the more lemons you have, the lower the fatality rate. That's sort of a silly example, but it is no different than this figure. This is also a correlation. This comes from a journal, and what they did is, this is a case control study. They had a group of people and they asked them, had them fill out a questionnaire, what did you eat for the last 24 hours? And then they went and looked at how much vitamin E there was in a typical one-day diet for these. And then they waited some years, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, something like that. And they looked at who had cancer and who didn't. And then they went back and plotted the average level of vitamin E in the diet. And what they saw was that those people who had cancer had lower vitamin E levels 10 years before than those who don't. So just as you might think with lemons affecting highway fatalities, there is the impression that the high levels, relatively high levels of vitamin E in the diet is preventing cancer. Okay, so that is a correlation. Each one of those individuals in that study has two things going on with them at once, a certain level of vitamin E in their diet and a certain level, and either they have cancer or they don't, or they will end up having cancer or they won't. It is possible, if you want to troubleshoot this, there is no reason that the vitamin E has to cause the cancer or protect against the cancer. Instead, maybe the reason that the vitamin E levels were lower is because the cancer was developing in them and it was depleting their vitamin, or maybe modulating their choice of food, something like that. There's no reason to think that one causes the other. And they can be just totally unrelated, just like the lemons and highway fatalities. So there is a logical problem with collecting correlations. Sometimes they're there because there is an underlying cause and effect relationship, but they can also be there for reasons that have nothing to do with each other, just spurious. Okay, so what we want is we want to prove causation. We want to prove that if you take vitamin E, that you won't get cancer. The only way to do that is to do a full experiment. So you're familiar with this. You start out with the observation. And in nutrition, a lot of observations come from these correlational studies. You look at data like on the last slide and you say, those people who had cancer had lower vitamin E levels. Here's my hypothesis. Maybe the vitamin E is protecting them. Maybe that's why this correlation is there. So then what you would do is you would put together an experiment to actually test it. And the experiments that test those observations that you get from correlational studies are clinical trials. If the experiments are done in animals or with tissue culture cells, those are usually experiments too. The problem with animal studies and cell studies is the cell studies don't take into account the process by which we ingest the food or the nutrients, or how it is that the chemicals get to our cells. And animal studies, animals have sometimes they have different metabolisms, and things that will happen in animals won't happen in us. So clinical trials are really the best way to prove causation. And really, before you act on any nutritional information that you get, you should insist that clinical trials have been done. So here's how a clinical trial that would actually prove vitamin E prevents cancer would look. This is what an experiment looks like. Okay, so first of all, what you do is you take a group of people who are all the same. They all, as far as you know, don't have cancer, in my case. So you start them out that way, and then you randomly assign them to two groups. One is going to be the treatment group, the other is going to be the control group. It's very important that it's the experimenter who picks who goes where, and that you don't allow people to choose which group that they're going to go into, because their choices could be what causes the outcome, not the actual treatment or control. So then after you've split them up into groups, then to prove that vitamin E prevents cancer, what you would do is the treatment group would get vitamin E pills, and the control group would be given placebo pills. Okay. Now, when you are doing a clinical trial, it's really important that the patient not know what type of pill that they're getting, because there's this phenomena called the placebo effect, where if the patient knows that they are getting the treatment, that they will influence the outcome in some ways. And believe it or not, if the physician knows whether the patient is getting the treatment or the placebo, that can affect their diagnosis too. They will see things because they expect them to be there. So the best type of studies are done so that neither the patient nor the physician knows which type they're getting, and that's called double-blind, a double-blind study. Then what you would do is you would wait for as long as it takes for people naturally to come down with cancer, which is, 10 years, 15 years, something like that. And then you would count the number of people who, in the two groups, who have cancer and compare them. Now, if your hypothesis is that vitamin E prevents cancer, then your prediction is that the number of cancer cases in the vitamin E group will be lower than the number of cases in the control group. Okay. So let's take a look at some studies. Because the question is, how do you know? How do you know if it's a clinical trial? How do you know if it's a correlational study? This is one of the reasons why I had you learn this vocabulary about case control, epidemiological study, clinical trial, is because they will usually tell you right on the article. So let's take a look at this one here. Intake of vitamin E, C, and A, and risk of lung cancer. First of all, the word risk, when you're doing a correlational study, you don't say that it causes an increase, because that uses the word cause. You say it increases their risk. So that right there gives you a hint that we're talking about a correlational study. But it doesn't even have to be here, okay? So here, epidemiology, it says right there. It will actually tell you what type of study it is. Okay. Let's look over here. So here, risk of cancer in relation to serum concentrations, matched case control analysis. They tell you right up front what type of study it is. And if it isn't in the title, sometimes you can usually find it by reading the abstract or just skimming it. All right. So both of these are correlational studies. Okay. Now, if you are looking for a clinical trial, if you have a clinical trial, what will happen is, first of all, a clinical trial, because it is the gold standard, it's the best type of study, it's very expensive to do, they will advertise it. They will tell you this is a good study by using the words trial. Another way that you can use it is with Medline, which is one of the reasons I had you use this database. They will tell you what type it is in this publication type, clinical trial, sometimes they'll say case control, etc. Note too that because they used a randomized design here, it will also be in the publication type. They're very proud of it, and then we'll make sure to check that box. So the conclusion is that this particular article is a clinical trial, and it shows cause and effect, not correlation. So I want you to now go to your results list and look through there and find a article that is a clinical trial. You may have to actually click on the title so that you can open up and read the abstract a little. Okay, so once you've found an article that's scholarly, peer-reviewed, it's a primary source, and you've made sure that it's a clinical trial, there are clinical trials and there are good clinical trials. Okay, a good clinical trial will have a large sample size, greater than 300. It will be randomized so that who goes into the control group and who goes into the treatment group is made by the researcher on a random basis, and it will use a double-blind design. Now sometimes it will be done single-blind because there's no way that the patient can influence the outcome, say, the serum levels of lipids. They can't influence their serum lipid levels. So they may only use a single blind design depending on the circumstances. But double blind is the best, and they will use it whenever they can. So that's the next level of decision to make. So once again, how do you know whether the clinical trial that you have is a quality one? You will see it in the abstract. Once again, it will be in the materials and methods section, which many times is in the abstract, and it will tell you. So here it is. They say randomized, it's double blind, they used a placebo, and they will give you the sample number. So here there were 3,994 plus another 700, so this is well above the 300 subjects minimum. So the conclusion is this particular trial is a high quality trial, and the numbers are big enough and the methods are big enough that the results can be relied on. So now what I'd like for you to do is to open up that abstract and figure out if the clinical trial that you are looking at right now is a high quality experiment. So you've got a high quality clinical trial, and presumably the results can be relied on. It's not enough, though, to rely on one study. And here is the problem. When you get multiple studies that you're bombarded with and they're contradictory, researchers know that this happens all the time. For every study that you do where you get a positive result, there will be people repeating your studies and they may have a negative result. You have to repeat the study multiple times with multiple investigators, multiple populations, and only when you have multiple studies that all end up with the same result can you know that this particular cause and effect relationship applies broadly to the population and it's not just a freak occurrence. So never rely on a single study. Let me show you an example of why one is not enough. Here is the first clinical trial of vitamin E that was done in 1994. And what they did is they had some people who smoked, and they were trying to give them some antioxidant vitamins to try to protect them, because antioxidants, one thing that it's thought that they do is protect you against damage by air pollution. So they had some smokers and they gave them vitamin E supplements and followed them for multiple years and then tracked how many people in that group came down with cancer and what type it was. So in the black bars, alpha tocopherol is vitamin E. The black bars are the people who were in the treatment group, and this was the control group. And what you can see is that for lung, bladder, colon, rectum, stomach, and all other cancers, the differences were not that great, but surprisingly, the people who took alpha tocopherol, vitamin E, there was almost a 50% reduction in the number of cancer cases of the prostate. So the conclusion that these researchers came to was based on their data. The vitamin E supplements seemed to reduce prostate cancer rates. And that started research. This was in 1994 that is still going on today. There was a study that was published in 2013. So based on if this was the only study that you relied on, and you were a man and you were of an age where you needed to start worrying about prostate cancer, you would start taking vitamin E, and that would be that. All right. So look at what happens next. All right, 1994 to 2011, many years later. The latest trial was done. It was a huge population, and what they did is they gave people vitamin E supplements and followed them for 10 years. So there was people who had vitamin E, people who had the placebo, and they counted the number of cancer cases over time. And what you see is that for the first 3 years, there's no difference. But then over time, the people who took vitamin E actually had a higher cancer rate than the people who did the placebo. So they stopped the trial actually right here once they saw that it appeared that the vitamin E was actually worse for you. And all of this is what happened after they had stopped taking the vitamin E. So that was the beginning and that was the end. And in between 1994 and that particular study, there were 19 other clinical trials. Each one, they would be looking at different types of cancer, different twists on doses for the vitamin E. But in all 19 of those clinical trials, they came to the conclusion that vitamin E doesn't lower the risk of cancer. So out of 20 plus clinical trials, that first one was the only one that showed that cancer rates were lower, prostate cancer rates were lower. In addition, in those 19 clinical trials, it turns out that if you look at overall mortality rates, the people who took the placebo actually did better. They were less likely to die of heart attacks. So this was done as a clinical trial to prevent cancer, but it turned out the doses of vitamin E that they took to try and see an effect was actually hurting them in other ways. So this is a lesson in why it's not a good idea to jump on the bandwagon of any type of nutritional intervention based on a single study. So that is the final list. So what I would like for you to do is to print out this Medline search results that you have, maybe a couple pages. If you're working from a paper copy, you'll be able to mark it up. So what I want you to do is go through your list and classify each study as one of the following, either a review article, and if you see something that's a meta-analysis, that's a type of review article, an animal or cell culture study, a correlational study, or a clinical trial. And then for the clinical trials, put a plus sign by any clinical trial that shows that giving somebody the functional component you've been assigned improved their memory. That's a way to track the actual results. And then put an asterisk by those clinical trials in your list that were double-blind, used a placebo, had a large sample size, etc. All those criteria for a quality study. Okay. What I want you to do is when you come to class on Friday, we're going to use those printouts from your search results to do an in-class activity evaluating these various supplements. It would be helpful if for any of the clinical trials that you found, if you had the actual text in case you need to compare details like sample size. But just the abstract will do. And if you want to copy and paste them onto a single page so that it save on paper, that would work fine too.